Welcome Exiles to the build guide for Hollow Palm Ice Crash Zerker. Now let me just start this off with saying don't play this, and that might catch you off guard seeing that it's got clearly some good damage. The reality is by the time I got to red maps, I was so sick of pressing the Warcry buttons, I was ready to get out of this character. I didn't even get past level 87, I think. That being said, it's still a pretty strong character, and I'm sure there's maybe some useful information you can take away from how I built this to build your own Hollow Palm character. So I'm still going to put this video out there, so that way, if you're interested in building Hollow Palm, you can take some of these concepts and use it for your own. However, I would not recommend Berserker Warcrying it up, because you'll just want to tear your hair out after pressing the Warcry keys so many times. It literally makes you lose your mind a little bit. So let's get into the build. Now let's go over the Zerker gear. To start off with the helmet, we went for a multi-link helmet. The reason for doing this is sockets are a real problem for Hollow Palm because you don't get to have both your main hand and your offhand, and you don't get to have gloves. So you're missing a whole 10 sockets right there. And on top of that, with the Hollow Crash Zerker, I was planning to use multiple Warcries, so I was really socket starved to begin with. So part of my solution for that was getting a helmet with multiple links, so that way I could save some links on my damage setup. So that's what I did. I crafted this helmet with Essence of Horror, basically did it until I hit Dexterity, and then I did Remove Add Cold until I hit Hypothermia, and then I re-rolled the prefixes a few times until I got increased area of effect, and I thought, okay, area is cool, I'll keep that. If you get Conk Effect, you can get up to 50% more damage, and you'll just destroy bosses even more. Next up is the Amulet. We're going with Astromentis on this one. This is not the best in slot. The best in slot is going to be a rare crafted amulet where you awaken orb, increase dexterity, and increase all attributes, and then you use harvest crafts to get stuff like T1 Wed, Cold Pen, Life. That's going to be your best in slot amulet. This is just a cheap option that works really well, and you can use it for a while until you get a bigger budget to expand your gear there. For rings, we went with unset rings. Basically what you want on these is Tier 1 dexterity, if you can get it, some good resistances, elemental damage with attacks, and then some form of life. That's all you're really looking for. I bought these two rings at 5C a pop with, basically they needed a couple harvest crafts to really finish them up, so I think the people completely undersold them. So definitely look at the market, see if you can find some decent rings that you can fix with harvest crafts, and you might end up with things like these for really cheap, because I got these for 5C, and I used a couple harvest crafts to get them to the point they are now, and they turned out really well. For the belt is like the most agonizing, or not agonizing, but it's like you start sinking currency into it with no end in sight type of deal, and I'll be honest, the belt I have now, because I haven't really finished crafting it, is like marginally better than the Cyclopean Coil, if not maybe a little bit worse in some ways. So really, if you don't have a lot of currency, just grab a well-rolled Cyclopean Coil and you'll be set. Once you get some more currency, you're going to have to craft what I have here, which is you get yourself a Hunter or a Elder Stygian Vise, and you have to throw Dexterity Essences at it until you hit increased attributes. From there, hopefully you hit T1, then you're going to look into doing harvest crafts to basically fix all the affixes. You can do some reroll prefixes until you get increased life, flat life, and then use harvest crafts to also craft on Wed by doing an augment attack and then remove attack, add attack until you have a high tier Wed. And then last thing is your last resistance there, and you can just use craft from the bench, or you can use harvest crafts to once again get a perfect res on your belt. Next up for the boots, we went with Gurrican's Flight. These are amazing for dex stacking builds because they give you a ton of flat life per your dexterity. With my character, I have 1200 dex. That means that these boots roughly give me 240 life, which is a huge amount of flat life for boots, along with giving me movement speed and some regen and making it so burning ground, chilled ground, and shock ground don't affect me, which is really kind of a nice quality of life when it comes to map mods, because you get those ground effects and you're just like, well, that doesn't affect me, and that's kind of the value of these boots. For the chest piece, it's kind of the same thing as the belt crafting. We went with a astral plate because astral plates give us more resistances. The reality is you can get away with doing a evasion chest piece and you'll have less resistances. You'll just have to make those up somewhere else, but they'll be easier to craft. If you have an astral plate, you have to craft them with dexterity essences. If you don't have an astral plate, if you have an evasion chest piece, it can naturally roll dexterity, in which case you can just use some like pristine fossils type of scenario to try to get increased dex and good life and dex all in one piece of armor. One thing I should probably note here is you'll notice I have a Mjolnir, and Repentance that are not really able to be worn by me because I don't have enough intelligence for them. This is solely so I could have some extra gem sockets to level up more gems in the build while I played it. And since they are unequipable by me because there's too high of an intelligence requirement, I can put them on and put gems in them, and the gems will level, but it won't count as me wearing them, so they still work with Hollow Palm. For the flask setup, we went with a mana flask, a sulfur flask, Lion's Roar, Adziri's Promise, and Quicksilver. Quicksilver obviously for the movement speed, Lion's Roar and Adziri's Promise for the damage, a sulfur flask for, it was just some random flask that lasts a certain duration, and I just had immunity to freeze on it, so I used it. You can swap this out for something else if you want to, like a Assault Flask or another Damage Flask. That's up to you. And the Mana Flask is when you had some issues with sustain a little bit. We had Attack Leech, so for the most part we didn't have too much mana issues, but it would occasionally come into play and it'd be nice to refill your mana. Passive tree. Now this is probably one of the more awkward deck stacking passive trees you're ever going to see in your life, and the reason for that is I'm not in the dex area of the tree at all. Dex is all over here, and I'm all over in this strength area, so it's a very awkward tree to some extent. But I'll kind of go through the reasons why that is. To start off with, we're a Marauder, so we have to start over here. And we grab a bunch of dex on these initial nodes by using a fluid motion. It allows you to transform strength nodes into dexterity, basically meaning this initial portion here still feels like I'm in a dex tree, and it works out pretty well. But the second you get over to these nodes over here, and over here, you can't really do that, especially considering I'm using other jewels in these areas. For example, Brutal Restraint is a great jewel to use on dex stacking builds because it can make notables have increased dexterity. I unfortunately only hit one of these on one of my notables I was using. I didn't really take too many times to like divine these up. Eventually, with a few more divines, you probably could hit dexterity more times than I did. I was fine to settle for blind and max life and dexterity. But if you divine it a few more times, you can get something that's going to give you a lot more damage than what I have here. Now, for the reason I'm also over here, it's also for War Cries. War Cries is kind of what was building this character around. There's a lot of powerful War Cries in that Enduring Cry gives you a ton of life sustain, it gives you endurance charges, it gives you defense. Then there's stuff like Seismic Cry, which gives a monster amount of damage. You have Infernal Cry, which also gives a lot of damage. You have Intimidating Cry, which doubles your damage. It's all damage stacking, basically. So for War Cries, I ended up speccing a lot into them for cooldown recovery speed and buff effect and a few other extra effects that are nice, like removing an ailment, like giving me an additional exerted attack, and basically giving me life recovery. So I'd be popping off all these War Cries, and I'd be getting a lot of life recovery from them. So because I was speccing so hard into War Cries and taking advantage of those for damage, I couldn't be over here grabbing dex nodes, more or less, because I had to be over in the strength part of the tree. Now I make up for this with cluster jewels. The cluster jewels I use are kind of an interesting craft. Not really, probably that interesting, but basically what I'm doing here is I'm really interested in the small passive points, not the notables. It's not something you see in too many builds, but occasionally you'll see it here and there. But basically what you do is you grab a jewel with as many passives as possible, and you're rolling them for the good small stats that make your build to perform well. So here I have a jewel where I went for T1 Dex, I went for increased small passive effect, I went for flat life, and I went for a resistance. Obviously I didn't fix up the resistance. I could have with Harvest Crafts. And then what you end up having is these passives, these small passive points that do quite a lot for your build. See here I get flat life, I get good resistance, I get a lot of dex, and I get physical damage for each one of these nodes. These are huge for damage on the build. I do the same thing over in this cluster as well. So with these clusters, it kind of starts picking up the pace for where I lost out in getting a lot of dexterity on my travel nodes, because each one of these travel nodes has dexterity with it. Now, I didn't even divine these to perfection. If I divine these to perfection where I would have 8 dexterity, I think they might go from 9 flat to 11 flat. I think 8 might be the breakoff point where the 35% increased effect would make it go to a whole 11 dexterity. Also, I could get the fire res up to, I think, about 10%. I think the fire res goes up to like 7 or 8. I'm not 100% sure. But point is, these end up being very powerful small passives. Now, the way you craft these is using metallic fossils. This basically eliminates all the notables from being able to occur, which gives you the highest chance that you'll hit dexterity and increased effect. All you're really doing is throwing a bunch of random metallic fossils until you get T1 dexterity and either 25% increased effect or 35% increased effect of small passives. When you hit that, you'll be able to then fix your other notables to be high flat life and resistances. If you have mana or something like that, you have to take the annul. But if you get something like flat ES, You can just do remove defense, augment life, and the only node it can hit is flat life. And then you can remove add life until you get tier 1 life. And it's about not quite a 1 in 3, maybe a 1 in 4 that you hit tier 1 life. So it's not going to take you too many rolls to hit tier 1 life on these jewels and get a pretty big advantage out of it. I got pretty unlucky with my remove add lives, and I only got T2 onto this jewel, but still, you're getting a lot of flat life here, and it's really good for the build. Next up for the build on the other clusters, I went with Crywolf and Lead by Example. The reason I did these is, one, Lead by Example just means we always have Onslaught, always up, we're always moving fast, we're always attacking fast. It's a feel good if you don't grab Onslaught somewhere else, along with Crywolf, which allows us to have a minimum of 10 power every time we Warcry, which basically means if we're below our 25 Warcry limit, this is a portion of Zerker here, if we're below 25 rage, we get 10 rage per 5 power, which means when we Warcry, if our minimum power is 10, we'll get 20 rage out of it. And that will happen again the second time we Warcry. If I can press the right button, you'll see we got another 20 power because we were below. So this is basically a way to keep us being able to generate rage, so that way we can lose rage and then proc our Berserker Ascendancy. So speaking of our Ascendancy, we went Berserker solely for the sake of damage. That's the reality. We have a 40% multiplier here and a 50% multiplier here. There's a huge damage multipliers along with all the Warcry damage multipliers we have. Now, in hindsight, this just ended up being quite a painful dance because you'd have to Warcry so much to get the procs of Warbringer and really take full advantage of the extra damage. And on top of that, I couldn't really take advantage of Rite of Ruin, which would be one of the key staples of the Berserker, because with this Warbringer, whenever I was over 40 rage, I'd be losing rage every time I Warcried. So it'd be this constant dance between 40 and 20 where it just would keep going up and down, and it just wouldn't be consistently the full benefit of Rite of Ruin. So I ended up swapping out Rite of Ruin for Pain Reaver for the Leech Life and Leech Mana, because I didn't really feel like I was getting that much of a benefit out of Rite of Ruin. It was really strong for the first two nodes for Normal and Cruel Lab, but then once I got over to Merciless and Uber, the next two Ascendancy nodes felt completely underwhelming. I'm realizing now I forgot to go over Gemlink's Pantheon Bandits, so I'm going to do that real quick. To start off with, it was the helmet, which we had Ice Crash in, Fortify, Elemental Damage with Attacks, and Pulverize. You'll notice none of these things are full leveled, none of them are quality. The reality is I didn't play the character long enough to care to fix any of that, so keep that in mind when I'm going over these Gemlinks. It's not because I don't know how to optimize the character, I didn't take the time to do it. Now, next up in the chest piece, we have Intimidating Cry, Seismic Cry, Enduring Cry, Infernal Cry, Second Wind and Dash. This is where all the spam fiesta comes in, and this is where I started to hate the character. The reality, it was really effective for damage to stack all these war cries because they're all big damage multipliers, and it would make me hit really hard. I mean, this is probably the hardest I've ever seen a Resolute Technique build hit, and on top of that, it still wasn't worth it. It still wasn't worth it, but that's what I was doing in my chest piece. A lot of my links were taken up with all these cries, which made the socket starvation even more real for my character. You'll see I had to do 2 unset rings to get Ancestral War Chief, Berserk, and I ended up not really ever even using Ancestral War Chief because I had my Berserk on left click, and to get my Ancestral War Chief out, I would have to press Control and then one of these keys. And I was too busy just spamming these and hitting things to even remember about my Ancestral War Chief, and I basically never used it. So you probably could go without the Sunset Ring, or swap in something more useful for a jewel here that doesn't require you to press a button. Next up, we have Blood and Sand. This is strictly for the AoE or the more damage, depending on if you're bossing or not bossing. Frankly, I forgot about it, and I always had AoE on. And Frost Bomb, that's so we can get more Cold Pen, because we don't have a lot on the tree. As well as Hatred and Herald of Ash. Herald of Ash basically is just so we could have some pretty effects when we kill monsters. I'm pretty sure Herald of Purity does more damage for us. And Hatred because it's a great damage multiplier for Ice Crash, giving us more cold damage as well as giving us gain 25% of our damage as cold. Now moving on to the Pantheon. These I went for Soul of Brine King. This is basically so you can get some stun lock avoidance, because stun lock's a real problem with Berserkers taking more heavy hits, as well as Soul of Gurkhan, which I was going to use this just for the movement speed, and frankly I forgot about it, so I wasn't even taking advantage of Zerker because the real reason I wanted it is so I could move faster while in town. So big bummer there, but we move on. For bandits, we went ahead and we killed all of them, and that kind of wraps up the character. Don't play this build. If anything, make a different type of Hollow Palm build. Probably the most valuable thing you can get out of this is doing large cluster jewels like this. Stuff like that's really good for deck stacking, but don't do war cries. Not like this. It wasn't worth it, and it will be a long time before I ever consider spamming war cries again. Y'all have a good one. Thanks for watching.